Hey everyone. So we actually have, it lists two lectures right here in front of you today, Populism and Progressivism in Texas. We're actually going to be splitting this up into two different lectures. So in this video we'll be covering populism in Texas, and in the next video we will be covering progressivism. That video will be up on Wednesday. I will live stream it on Wednesday, and it'll also be, of course, recorded for you. So today we're going to be dealing with populism. Now, populism is one of those words that, particularly in like our current kind of political environment, has been sort of all over the place. You might hear it quite a bit if you pay attention to modern politics. And so let's talk about what it is first before we can kind of define what populism is in Texas and how it influences kind of the culture of Texas and also the culture of the United States. So let's define populism. And before we do that, I want to say that we're roughly talking about the period like 1870s to about 1900. So we're kind of in like the late 19th century here. So to define populism, I'm going to put it up on the screen here for you. This is a good definition of the word populism. Now, note that it says little p populism, meaning like lowercase p, and I'll explain why there's a difference here in a second. So it says little p populism is a belief, a political ideology, in a belief in the power of regular people and in their right to have control over their government rather than a small group of political insiders or a wealthy elite. So essentially, populism is the idea of people power, that the common folks should have power equal or greater than the kind of wealthy or like the political elites that might live in Washington or work for the political parties. Now, let's talk about a few different things. Why is it little p populism rather than like an uppercase populism? So if you put a capital letter on populism and put an uppercase P there, that indicates a political party, because there is an actual populist party. In this case, when you leave it lowercase, what that is talking about is just a political ideology. Now you may be wondering why there's a picture of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders on the screen. So the term populism really came back to the forefront in modern politics in our current era in 2016 and 2015, because Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders were both running for president. Now, of course, Donald Trump wins the presidency and Bernie Sanders didn't win his party's nomination, but both of these men had a similar style, although obviously from very different political ideas. Donald Trump being a more conservative Republican, Bernie Sanders being a very, very like left-leaning Democrat. But they both kind of used a populist strategy. Donald Trump, of course, in many of his speeches, like when he famously proclaimed, like, "I love the poorly educated," as a way of trying to say that he identified with common people. Bernie Sanders' entire political career has been kind of a populist, striding through American politics, right? He advocates for the poor and the people who don't have health insurance and all of this. And so essentially what Trump and Bernie both, again, from different political ideologies, are appealing to is that the American people should run the country rather than like insiders or a wealthy elite, right? Donald Trump famously calls it the deep state. But the idea is that people should have the power, right? That's the important thing. And this is an important moment in terms of like Texas history. We are in the 1870s. And so let's talk about why is populism arising during this moment? Like, why are people advocating for empowerment in the 1870s and in the late 19th century? So before we talk about the Grange itself, let's talk about just farmers and what they're doing in American society. So farmers had a hard life, right? Farming is hard work. It is a struggle to make money. And particularly when the second industrial revolution was happening right around this time period, when railroads and steel companies and oil companies are making all this money, farmers are really struggling amid all of this economic change. It's really difficult for farmers to make more money than what they're already making, because they can only plant so many crops. They only have so much land. And so many farmers were really struggling. You can see in that, I've got some statistics up on the screen for you, that says that in 1860, 50% of wealth was owned by farmers, and they accounted for 30% of the national income. That was in 1860, so that's like pre-Civil War. By 1910, though, 50 years later, farmers were down to 20% of the wealth and only 18% of the national income. So their wealth share had dropped significantly, going from 1/2 to 1/5, and now they also were making a lot less money per year. Now, part of this is that people are getting pushed out of farming, right? Because farming was increasingly not profitable. But what this also shows us is that farmers are just struggling. You know, the prices of crops were going down, and that means that farmers had to maximize the amount of crops they grew, so they would grow on every inch of land. But the problem is that if every farmer is doing that, you're going to have more and more crop available, which means that prices are going to go further down. And so it was like a vicious cycle for them. Additionally, in the year 1880, 37% of all farms in America were run by tenant farmers, meaning that 37% of Americans didn't own their own farms. Now, and that's a bad thing, because that means that a lot of the profits are going to not the farmers themselves, but to their landlords, oftentimes who are, particularly in the South, like old plantation families in a way. So, many people grew cash crops as well. They didn't grow subsistence farming because it didn't make them any money to grow things they could eat. They would grow cotton or they would grow tobacco. So they couldn't turn to their communities when times got tough, right? Everyone else was doing the same thing, trying to make money to sell cotton. Well, when times got tough, who would you turn to help feed you? Kyle Wilkeson, who is a historian, I believe his first name is Kyle. Wilkeson is his last name for sure. He had a good quote that I think illustrates this moment, and he called it the poverty of the propertyless. The idea that these farming communities and these farming families are increasingly impoverished, partly because they don't own their own property, but also because of the prices are dropping, and they're just really struggling in this late 19th century. And when mass groups of people start struggling, it can lead to political movements. People begin to get together and try to figure out, how can we fix the problems that we're confronting? So that's where the Grange is going to come around. One thing I want to talk about before that we get to that movement is railroads. So in the late 19th century, we start to see the creeping of railroads into Texas. Now, if you remember the last lecture we did when we talked about the Old West and like the cattle driving era, there weren't that many railroads in Texas because they had to drive the cattle up to the rail stations in Kansas and in Missouri. But now, by the time you get to 1900, even this map has 1926 on it, but by the time you get up into the 20th century, there's lots of railroads that are coming into Texas. To give you some numbers here, and you don't need to know these, in 1875, there was about 1,600 miles of railroad track in Texas, so 1,600. That was 1875. By 1900, just 25 years later, there's 10,000 miles of track, right? So you're talking about a tremendous increase in the amount of railroads that are coming into Texas. Now, this does bring some positive things, right? The major cities are all connected together, right? You can see like the Austin area right here, connected to Houston, connected to the DFW area up here, even all the way connected to places like, this is Lubbock right here in Amarillo and El Paso, San Antonio down here. So it's connecting the major cities together, which is a good thing. People are able to move around a bit more freely with the railroads. That's a positive. But farmers rely on the railroads to ship their goods. And that kind of puts them in a vulnerable position because most of these railroads are owned only by a few companies. And thus, it's easy for those companies to take advantage of the fact that the farmers need them. So these companies would often get together and kind of talk to each other and say, okay, like we're going to set the price at this level. None of us are going to go below this level. We're not going to go any cheaper than this. We'll go up, sure, to make more money, but we're never going to go below this floor price. And what that means is that they're preventing competition. And so what would start to happen is farmers who needed to sell their crops, on the railroads, they needed the railroads to ship their crops. They would have a hard time because now all of a sudden the prices are higher than they used to be because the railroad companies are all kind of working together. This is called price setting, what the railroad companies were doing is they were setting the prices. And what this does is it squeezes the farmers even more, right? Now, not only are they struggling to grow as much crop as they can, but now they're having trouble getting that crop to market because the railroads are so powerful. And so this is going to cause people to fight back, right? They're going to form movements to try to improve their lives, and eventually it's going to lead to political movements. So now let's talk about the Grange itself. The Grange starts in 1873. It was in a small town called Salado, Texas. Some of you may have been there. I believe it's near the Austin area. Salado is spelled S-A-L-A-D-O, Salado, Texas. The Grange didn't start off as a political movement. So this was actually not a political movement led by farmers. What the Grange was more of like a social movement, almost like a way to connect farmer to farmer. Because if you think about old farming communities, they were very spread out. Most farmers, were miles and miles away from their neighbors, and so you didn't see that many people. So being a farmer out in the West, even in a place like Texas, could be very isolating. You just don't have that much of a community around you. And thus, when hard times hit, say your crops don't do very well, you're running low on money, right? You don't have a lot of food. When those hard times hit, your community is very small. And so what the Grange did was it set out to connect farmers together, to try to provide more social engagement for farmers, right? To help give them a better life. So, and this is a group run by farmers, right? The Grange is a farmer-led kind of movement. And it grew really rapidly. Within the first couple years, there's only a few hundred. Like, I think it was founded in 1873. By 1879, there was about 800 of them or so. But then by 1884, just a few years later, there's like 13,000. So it grows really fast, and it shows you that these farming communities are really interested in kind of connecting together, right? They want to be connected together. And so what they're going to start doing is kind of advocating for themselves. They're going to try to better the lives of farmers. Sometimes this would take the play, they would reach out to local government. Sometimes they would try to do things in their local communities. Occasionally they advocated for political positions, right? So like, this is very related to the lecture for next time, which is progressivism, which is the idea of using trying to get reforms, particularly by using government power. These Grangers wanted reforms. They wanted the government to protect the rights and livelihoods of farmers. So for example, they wanted the government to create some sort of federal bureau to regulate the railroads. There wasn't one at this point in time, so the railroads could kind of just do whatever they wanted, and with no oversight. And the farmers thought that was unfair. They're like, dude, the railroads are taking advantage of us, and we want someone to regulate them. They also wanted a direct election of senators was something they wanted. Back in the day when the Constitution was written, senators were elected by state representatives rather than the people themselves. And so the Grangers were like, well, that kind of cuts us out of the equation. We want to have a say. Perhaps the biggest influence, though, of the Grange was education reform. So, and I think this will make sense if you, again, kind of put yourself in the shoes of a farmer back in the late 1800s. These farmers didn't have a lot going for them, right? They were often very impoverished. They lived these isolated lives out on the, in the countryside. And as a result, they didn't have schools. And so a lot of them, relatively illiterate, uneducated. And so, but the Grange gets together, and all these farmers start advocating for each other and say, we need better school systems. And so some of the things they accomplished were uniform textbooks, right? A textbook that was the same in the big cities as it was out in the countryside. They also got the school year cut off at 9 months, which was important for them because many of these farming families needed their children for the harvest, and so they're like, okay, we can have a 9-month school year, summer's off, kids are home helping with the harvest and these kinds of things. one of the other things that's important that actually is still around today is the consolidation of local or of rural schools. So, for example, up near Bryan College Station, there is a school district called A&M Consolidated, and if I'm correct, they got their start as a consolidation of local like farming communities. And there are a lot of those that exist out in Texas, right? Like once you leave kind of like the eastern part of Texas and you really get into the rural areas of West Texas, you can get into some places where there aren't a lot of people living. And so the best thing they can do is have these kind of consolidated schools that will take the children from like 3 or 4 little small communities and put them all into one place. But the Grange is important for a number of reasons. One of the things that it does is it shows that farmers are willing to work together. They're willing to stand up for each other and to try to advocate for each other. And this is important because farmers oftentimes can just get forgotten in larger societal conversations. They do work that most people don't even think about. Like when we go to the store and you just buy vegetables, you just buy them. You don't really think about where they come from or who grows them often. And so the Grange is important because it advocates for the people who are doing the growing, right? What they would call themselves is producers, right? They're producing for the rest of society. The other thing that it does is it sets the tone for the politics of the farmers. The Grange is a place where the farmers are all coming together and they're all talking and sharing their ideas and their hardships. And pretty soon people start to think like, we should do something about this. We don't have to just sit here and take it and suffer and let the railroads run over us. We can fight back. And so the Grange kind of sets this important foundation for a more political movement to emerge. And that political movement is called the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance was founded pretty quickly after the Grange was founded. It was founded in 1877, and you can see the flag up there. It says 1878. It was actually founded 1 year earlier. And the Farmers Alliance kind of grew out of the Grange as a more political movement than the Grange was. The Grange is more like a social movement, I would say, or even like an educational movement, whereas the Farmers Alliance is very clearly a political movement. The Farmers Alliance was first organized in Lampasas, Texas. Lampasas is up near Austin, if you've ever been up that way. It's like maybe 45 minutes to an hour outside of Austin. Lampasas is spelled like lamp, Lampasas, Lampasas. And the goal of the Farmers Alliance was to protect farmers, not just from railroads, but also from ranchers. Now that might sound odd because farmers and ranchers often live in like the same parts of the country, kind of more rural areas. But in Texas, there was definitely a social and economic difference between being a farmer versus being a rancher. Farmers were definitely looked down upon, at least in terms of like social class. They were seen as like lower class or at least uneducated. Whereas ranchers were given a certain amount of authority. They were viewed like the term cattleman meant something, not a cowboy, right? A cowboy is a dude who works cattle and who drives the ranges, and this usually young men untethered. Whereas a cattleman or a cowman is a guy who owned a ranch, which means they owned large amounts of cattle and usually had a lot of wealth that went with all that land ownership and owning all of those cows and this sort of thing. And so ranchers would sometimes take advantage of their power and they had a lot of political clout. They also had they would sometimes disrupt farming communities, letting their cows perhaps graze on farmland or these types of things. And so farmers were saying, hey, we need to protect ourselves from ranchers and also from railroads. And the Farmers Alliance was an interesting group because not only were they advocating for farmers, but they also saw themselves as kind of in solidarity with labor unions. They supported labor rights, and not just for farmers, but also for like people who are working in factories up in the Northeast. That's going to come into play in a minute, right? This kind of weird kind of alliance that's going to form between, or at least this cooperative that they try to form between like Northeastern labor union workers and farmers down in the South. So, this Farmers Alliance is much more radical than the Grange, right? The Grange was like I said, a social movement in more ways than the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance was a political movement, a radical one. These guys are demanding wholesale changes to America's economy. Let me give you some examples. So one of the things the Farmers Alliance wanted accomplished was the institution of an income tax. Now, in America today, we are used to getting taxed in a number of different ways, right? There are property taxes. In Texas, we have a sales tax. And nationally, there is an income tax. But the income tax was not put in place until the 16th Amendment, which was developed in 1913. And so during this era, the 1870s, there was no income tax. Well, the reason why these farmers wanted there to be an income tax is because they believed that poor people were being taken advantage of by wealthy people, and that wealthy people never had to pay into the system because they were never getting taxed, even though they were benefiting off of the system, off of capitalism and off of the labor of the lower classes. Farmers believed that the wealthy elite were not having to pay back into the system. They weren't being taxed. And so they advocated for an income tax. They also advocated, very similar to the Grange movement, for the direct election of senators. They wanted to have a voice in the process of electing senators. They also advocated for an 8-hour workday. So this is something that aligns them very much with labor unions from the era, is that they believed that the workday should be shortened to just 8 hours. Traditionally, the workday traditionally was whatever the boss told you to work. If you were working in a factory, you could work 10, 12. There were some steel mills that required you to work a 24-hour shift sometimes. So the Farmers Alliance is calling for all of these pretty radical changes to the American system. And what it shows is that there's this kind of like wave of resentment coming from the lower classes. There's this dedication to reforming the system, to progressing forward, to helping the farming communities in particular, obviously. But it's really striking that the lower classes in this moment are rising up, and they're rising up because they believe that they're not being taken seriously, and they believe that their desires and their needs aren't being met. And in a lot of ways, they were right. These people are being taken advantage of by the railroads, by politicians, by even by ranchers living nearby. And so basically, they're throwing down the gauntlet and saying, "We've had enough. We're going to stand up for ourselves." And the thing is, these groups actually had allies in politics. I love this quote here from S.O. Dawes. He's a Farmers Alliance lecturer. He's a guy who would travel around and give speeches to farmers to try to kind of like rally the troops, And he said, "The capitalist holds your confidence in one hand, while the other, he rifles your pockets." What he means here by capitalist is a person who owns the means of production, right? This is a very Marxist kind of idea that these capitalists, people like Andrew Carnegie or John Rockefeller or Cornelius Vanderbilt, the people who owned like steel and oil and railroads, these big industries, and these guys are like some of the wealthiest men in the world. And so S.O. Dawes is saying, these capitalists, they hold your confidence in one hand, trying to lift you up, but with the other hand, he's rifling your pockets. He's stealing from you. And so, there's definitely this sense amongst the farmers and amongst the lower classes in general that they're being taken advantage of. But they did have political power, or at least they did have political allies. Probably the most famous populist in Texas history is this man on the screen here. This is Big Jim Hogg. Hogg was a governor of Texas. He only had one term. He was the governor from 1891 to 1895. So the 1890s. In the 1890s, you can kind of look at the 1890s as the peak of the populist movement in the United States. Not just in Texas, but in the U.S. in general. Big Jim Hogg was the governor during this peak of populism, and he himself was a populist kind of sort of politician. In fact, there's some interesting things about Big Jim Hogg here. One of them is that he was actually the first native-born Texan to be governor. all the other governors before him had been born elsewhere. So this is kind of an interesting moment where you see a new generation taking charge that claims Texas as its homeland, right? Not transplants, right? Like Sam Houston was a transplant. He came from Tennessee, I believe, and moved to Texas. Whereas Jim Hogg, born and raised here, he was born in Cherokee County, which is out in East Texas. It's a very rural, deep East Texas county. And he's a good example of the type of leader that farmers wanted in office. Big Jim Hogg was and you can just tell by the name, Big Jim sounds like a populist. It's just this kind of like larger-than-life guy. And he was a big man, hence the name. And he would travel around and give these like kind of hell-raising speeches to farmers. He was famous for having this very like down-home, like folksy delivery, where he would kind of like tailor his speeches to the speech patterns of the people he was talking to. He had this like booming voice, and farmers really believed that Big Jim Hogg like spoke to them, like spoke to their issues, and believed in them. That's something that I think is interesting, is that there are a lot of politicians who try to appeal to the lower classes, and there are very few who are really effective at doing it. And Big Jim Hogg was one of those guys who was really effective at actually getting farmers to say, like, yeah, this guy's one of us, like, he gets it. What's interesting is before he became governor, this is in 1890, so Jim Hogg is running for governor in 1890, trying to win the election, and he's running as a populist. He's like, we gotta regulate those railroads, and we got to help the farmers, and all this kind of stuff. One of the things he campaigned on was welfare aid, meaning like money, welfare to Confederate veterans. 1890 is not that far removed from the end of the Civil War. There were still a lot of Confederate veterans. Many of them were starting to get older, and he was like, look, we got to care for these guys. He advocated for education reform. He believed that schools should have, better textbooks, more money, this sort of thing. He even advocated against lynchings, which was a big deal for the time. Lynchings were pretty common in the South, and he tried to pass an anti-lynching bill. He didn't succeed, but this is a guy who very much represented a change from like the older, more conservative style of Democrat that had been running Texas since the 1870s. But the key issue, Jim Hogg's key issue, was regulating the railroads. That was the thing that he kind of planted his flag in, this idea that we have to regulate the railroads. And the railroads tried to pool their money together to defeat him. The railroads all started raising money. Obviously the railroad owners were quite wealthy, so they didn't even need to raise money. They could just spend their own. And they financed somebody to try to defeat Jim Hogg. They financed a Democrat. Democrat loses. They try to finance the Republicans. He loses. The railroads even went so far as to try to cancel planned railroad construction, saying like, well, fine, if you're going to elect this populist, we're not going to build our railroads here in Texas. But Jim Hogg was so popular with like the lower classes, with the farmers, that he won anyway. And as a governor, he did regulate the railroads. In fact, he created one of the most powerful positions in Texas politics today, which is the Texas Railroad Commission. You may not be familiar with the Texas Railroad Commission. It's one of those political positions that's incredibly powerful, but often kind of rides below the waves, so to speak, floats beneath the surface. What the Texas Railroad Commission did back in the day when he implemented it was it regulated the railroads. So the Texas Railroad Commissioner is an elected position, and the person who is elected to do that job would regulate the railroad industry, meaning that they could stop them from setting prices, for example. This would have been hugely influential for the farmers who had been complaining about this for years. Well, the Railroad Commission position is still around today, but it's a bit different nowadays because railroads they don't need to be regulated in the same way they were back then. They don't have the stranglehold over the American economy they did back then. So nowadays, this is odd because it doesn't make any sense, but the Texas Railroad Commissioner's most important thing is actually regulating oil and gas. So in today's Texas, like in our current society, the Texas Railroad Commissioner's job, his most important job, is actually regulating the oil and gas industry, which of course is very big here in Houston. So very popular, very powerful position, and sometimes seen as a stepping stone to other and even higher positions. I believe Ted Cruz was Texas Railroad Commissioner before he became senator in Texas. However, there were limits to Hogg's populism. For example, Hogg believed in segregation, and he advocated for segregated railroads. So meaning that certain cars would be available for black people and certain cars would be available for white people, and you had to keep them separated. So that was a limit to Hogg's populism, that he did believe in kind of like racial segregation. He also did not believe in women's rights. The fight for women's equality was certainly going on during this period, but Jim Hogg did not make that part of his fight. He that was something that he generally ignored. And so what that shows you is that even these populists, even these guys who are trying to like help the lower classes and help the people who are struggling, they still kind of bend to these racial and gender norms, right? The patriarchy and like the racial discrimination that had existed for years and generations and hundreds of years is still going to linger, right? It's not like Jim Hogg didn't come in and change everything. He kind of changed some things, but other things he couldn't tackle or wouldn't tackle. Civil rights, of course, for African Americans and the women's suffrage movement is going to take more years. Women don't get the right to vote until 1920, and of course the civil rights movement takes many, many more years. Some would say it still continues. So I mentioned that the 1890s was kind of like this high watermark of populism in the United States. So let's look at probably the most famous election or the most famous moment of populism in the U.S., and that was the election of 1896. So, in 1896, you have an actual populist party emerge. They had actually been around for a little bit longer than that, but so you essentially had three parties in 1896. You had the Republican Party, which stayed kind of the same, mostly powerful up in the New England Northeast area, often propelled by big corporations and banks and financiers. You had the Democratic Party, which was very powerful in the South, mostly like run by segregationists in the South, Democrats. Then you had the Populist Party, which was very powerful kind of in the West, but also in the South as well, because the Populists were a kind of farmers' party. They called themselves the People's Party, but the people who were kind of who had kind of started it, many of them were farmers. So the populists were powerful both in the South and in the West. And so in 1896, this kind of populist movement kind of boils over into this presidential election. In 1892, I love this quote here. You can kind of see how radical the populist platform is. They say that we believe the time has come when the railroad corporations will either own the people or the people must own the railroads. Now that is a radical statement. The populist movement was quite a progressive and some would say radical movement. So let me kind of show you what I'm talking about here. So the populist platform had some elements of kind of like the Farmers Alliance ideas, right? You can see number 2 right here, direct election of senators. That was something that the Farmers Alliance wanted. Protection for labor unions, that was also something the Farmers Alliance had advocated for, as well as, of course, labor unions over the many years. But one of the things that set the Populist Party apart, but also linked it with the Farmers Alliance, was government ownership of the railroads, which was a radical idea. This idea that the government should kind of come in and take over the railroad companies was incredibly radical, and some would say like too radical, right? This was something that was way too radical for the time period. And so, the Populist Party is not just farmers, though, and I want to try to draw out this point very carefully here, that the populists called themselves the People's Party, and we need to drill down and talk about what they mean by the People's Party. So at the very beginning of this lecture, I talked about populism, little p populism, as like the power of the common people, right? And so the populists looked at themselves, the Populist Party looked at itself as kind of a union, an alliance of all of what they called the producing classes. So what does that mean, the producing classes? So farmers believed that they produced things because they literally grew things out of the ground and harvested them and then sold them. Labor unions, meaning people and people who worked in factories, argued that they produced things because they worked in factories and built things with their hands, right? Whether that was steel or automobiles or whatever it was. So these are the producing classes, like the working classes that are actually making the goods that are being sold. Now, the reason why they call themselves the producing classes and not the working classes is because they're juxtaposing themselves with the capitalist class. So they're saying, we are doing the producing. The capitalists over there they're just making money based off of our work, right? That's what the populists are arguing, is that they were the ones doing the actual work, that the people are the ones doing the actual work, while the capitalists, the people who own the companies, are just reaping the benefits of it, and making all the money, and then they use that money to try to stifle our, political rights or our, wages or whatever. And so the goal of the Populist Party was to unite not just farmers, but also to bring them in an alliance with the labor unions and the working class of like the Midwest and the Northeast, right? That worked in the textile factories and the steel mills and the oil production plants in Ohio, these sorts of things. But there is a problem with this. What the farmers wanted and what the labor unions wanted weren't always compatible. Let me give you an example of this. So farmers want to make more money, right? They believe that their economic prospects are being stifled, whether that's because of railroads or because of mass production of crops or whatever. In order to make more money, farmers need the price of crops to go up. All right, that's the easiest way for them to just make more money, is if people paid more for food. But that's the problem in big cities. If you think about it from a labor unionist perspective, a working class person who works in like a steel mill up in Pennsylvania, they're already making no money, and they don't want to pay more for food because they're already struggling to put food on the table. And so when the farmers are like, we want people to pay more for food so we can make more money, these working class folks in the urban areas are like, no, we already struggle to survive, right? So there's kind of like this difficulty in getting both sides to understand why they're advocating for themselves the way they are. So there's always this tension between what the labor unions in the urban areas want and what the farmers in the rural areas want. There's this disconnect between, there's a divide between the rural areas and the urban areas, very similar to what we see today actually in the United States, that the urban areas and the rural areas are very, very different in terms of their political ideologies. Now, one thing that's important to note, though, about the People's Party is that it provided a gateway for women to get involved in politics. Women have been advocating for their rights going all the way back to the founding of the United States. Abigail Adams sent a very famous letter to her husband John Adams saying, that we hope you remember the ladies, is how she put it. We hope you remember the ladies when you write the Constitution. Of course, the men didn't remember the ladies; they left them out entirely. But by the time you get to the 1880s and 1890s, the populist movement really provides a place for women to get involved. So the women's suffrage movement and the women's rights movement is kind of going to enmesh itself. It's going to integrate itself into the populist movement. You can see it right here with this is Mary Lease. She was a populist reformer and a suffragist, so she was very much like an advocate. And she said, Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. And she said that farmers should raise less corn and more hell. Right, so she's advocating for farmers to go out there and raise some hell, right? Go out there and cause some trouble, essentially, to try to set things right. Notably, she is taking Abraham Lincoln's phrase, right? The government of the people, by the people, for the people, and kind of flipping it and saying this is not a government of the people, but in fact we are being taken advantage of by the wealthy financiers and Wall Street. That's a very populist idea, and you've probably heard that before if you've heard Bernie Sanders speak, right, of the billionaires and millionaires that he criticizes in his speeches. This is the same idea, that the people themselves, the American people, are being taken advantage of by this wealthy elite that kind of have all the power. And you may be wondering, well, that's all fine, but how does this relate to populism? So let's look at that. So here's a map of when women got the right to vote in their particular state before the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. So, women got the right to vote in the United States in 1920. That's the National Amendment. But before that, it was kind of up to the states. Individual states could give women the right to vote if they wanted to. Let's look at where it first starts. If you look at this map, the very first state that gives women the right to vote is right here, Wyoming, 1869. And then right around them are the next ones. Colorado, 1893. Idaho and Utah, 1896. Look at the difference between this western area and the east. This east coast right here doesn't give women the right to vote at all, not until the National Amendment passes. There are some up here in the New England area that finally do around 1917, but it's really the West that is the driver of women's suffrage. Why? Why the West? Let's talk about that. So if you're moving west during this period of time, let's say like 1880s, 1890s, you're moving west, even earlier 1860s in terms of Wyoming, the best place that you leave from is Independence, Missouri. Missouri's right here. Independence is roughly right here somewhere. And you're going this way. If you're a poor person, you're not riding on the railroads. Right? The railroads would be the safest way to travel, but that's not how most people did it because most people couldn't afford it. Most people were going in wagons, which meant that you were, in a covered wagon. You got yourself, you got, if it was me, it would be me, my wife. If I had kids, my kids would be in the back, with all of our belongings with us. And if you're going out there, you're going through Kansas territory, which is now a state, right? Kansas, and then you finally get out to Wyoming, maybe even on into Idaho or Oregon. That's a long way to go. You're out there for months. And so the idea was that if you're a guy, like if I was out there trying to move to Wyoming and my wife was with me, my wife is just as important as I am in making that move happen. Right? There's this idea in the West that women were just as critical as men in kind of forging the West. Whereas in the East, there was this kind of like old school patriarchy that existed that was very resistant to change. Whereas the West was founded just as much by women as it was by men. Women helped pave those trails to get out there just as much as men did. And so as a result, they claimed political rights. They were like, look, we basically helped you guys get here, so it's our right to be able to vote. And the guys looked around and they were like, yeah, that makes sense. Additionally, in some of those western states, there was a dearth of women. There just weren't a lot of women out there. There were some places where the ratio was as high as 6 to 1, 6 men to 1 woman. And so suffrage was seen as a way of like recruiting, right? Like, hey, come move west and you can vote in our elections. So for many women, the populist movement was the first time they felt like they could really make their voices heard in a way that was beyond just like, hey, can we have the right to vote, please? Right? In a way that was beyond just the temperance movement and the suffrage movement. This was actually like a political movement that they felt like they really had a stake in because populists in general were in favor of women's suffrage. So, 1896, we're going to have a presidential election, one of the most famous presidential elections in American history. The guys running for president are this guy on the left. This is William Jennings Bryan, and his counterpart, the Republican, is William McKinley. Now, I need to take some time to tell you about William Jennings Bryan and his political parties. And I say parties, plural, because William Jennings Bryan was running under 2 political banners in 1896. So back in this day, what would happen is these political parties would have a convention and they would get together and figure out who they wanted their candidate to be. And then they would basically tell them, like, hey, we want you to be our candidate. And both the Democrats and the populists chose William Jennings Bryan to be his candidate. Now, Bryan could have said, I'm going to run as a Democrat, or I'm going to run as a populist, and instead he just said yes, and decides to run as both, right? So Bryan just is like, I'm going to run as a Democratic populist. Like, I'm just going to do both. I'm going to be a Democrat and a populist at the same time. This kind of provides, this makes things a little bit tense because not all of the Democrats in the South, particularly like the large landowners, were in favor of the populists. But nevertheless, being a Democrat is also going to hurt him in the northern areas of the country, because the Democrats were not trusted by Northerners because of the whole like Civil War thing, that whole like slavery thing. There was definitely a lot of that lingering distrust. And so when Bryan is like, I'm going to run as both, there were a lot of Northerners who were like, I don't know if I'm going to vote for this Democrat. So this election, though, interestingly, is one of the most expensive elections in American history. Look at this graph here. So this graph is showing presidential campaign spending as a percentage of the GDP. GDP is a gross domestic product, which is essentially like a calculation of how much money the economy is making, the goods, a calculation of the money the economy is making in any given year. And if you compare presidential campaign spending to GDP, you get an idea of how much is being spent, how much of the country's wealth is being spent on a presidential campaign. Most of the time, that wealth is pretty low, or that spending is pretty low. But in 1896, look at that, you get this massive bump in spending. And you probably guessed correctly in your head that the reason why so much money gets spent in this election is because businessmen don't want Bryan to win. All right, I'm going to flip back to this screen. Bryan, the populist candidate, is running on a populist platform. He's calling for the regulation of railroads, if not the nationalization of them. He's calling for all of these populist ideas that were really anti-big business. They were anti-Wall Street. And so businesses funnel money into McKinley's campaign. McKinley, of course, being a Republican. And so all this big spending, most of it is coming from the big businesses who were supporting McKinley for president. And in fact, they essentially bought the presidency. If you look at the map in 1896 here, you can see that William Jennings Bryan and McKinley are pretty close in the popular vote. Bryan loses just slightly, 51% to 47%. But in the Electoral College vote, McKinley wins pretty decisively. What's fascinating about this map, though, isn't just that Bryan loses, but it's where he loses and where he wins that's, I think, interesting. So McKinley wins this northeastern section up here, which is no surprise. That was the stronghold of the Republican Party. Bryan wins the South, again, no surprise. The old Confederacy, right, all the way from Virginia all the way down into Tennessee, Arkansas, and Texas. No surprise that he wins those states. Everybody expected that to happen. The real contested area was this western bit right here, and particularly this, like what we would call today, this Rust Belt area right here. The reason why, so again, just to recalculate here, McKinley wins New England. Bryan wins the South, no surprise, old Confederacy. This area right here, the West, was generally expected to go to Bryan. This area right here was the contested area right here. This kind of like what we would call today the Rust Belt. Back then it was the industrial hub of the nation, right? Ohio, Pennsylvania. This is where steel was being made. This is where many of the oil companies were during this time period. And so the fact that Bryan loses those states tells us something very very fascinating, which is that all of those labor unionists and those working class people that are living in those states actually didn't vote for Bryan. It shows you that divide between the farmers who believed in populism and believed in Bryan and tried to reach out and say, like, we're on the same side as you labor unionists. Labor unionists couldn't quite get there, though. They didn't quite believe that Bryan and the farmers had their best interests in mind. And so, Bryan did well in these states, but it wasn't good enough to turn the tide. And so McKinley wins, instituting a pretty conservative Republican administration. But even though the populists lose, and eventually the Populist Party dies off, this is definitely like their high point in American politics. even though the populists kind of like die out, what's interesting about the populists is that they actually get most of what they wanted. It just doesn't happen immediately. Over time, a lot of the populist demands actually do come to fruition. For example, the populists wanted direct election of senators. They get that in the 19-teens. The 17th Amendment allows for the direct election of senators. They wanted an income tax. 16th Amendment, 1913, allows for the taxation of Americans' incomes. They advocated for regulation of businesses. In the early 1900s, they're going to get that. Teddy Roosevelt is going to come into office, and he's going to start regulating the railroads. So a lot of the things that these populists wanted, they're actually going to get, which shows that their political movement had a lot more influence than just winning an election. Oftentimes when we talk about history, we talk about it from the view of the victors, but the losers can be just as important, because their ideas aren't just going to like disappear and go away. All right, they still linger and kind of like reverberate around, and eventually other parties are going to pick them up and say, you know what, like we can use this idea to try to win votes, and if we can appeal to enough people, we can maybe do some good. So I'm going to end there for today, because in the next lecture we're going to pick up right where we leave off right here and talk about the progressive era. So I will see you guys then. I hope you guys are staying safe and everything, and I'll talk to y'all soon.